biological CO2, mineral sustainability, methane hydrates. We've got some projects going on with that. We have an offshore program, natural gas infrastructure. There's a lot of leaking wells out there, and methane mitigation techniques and technologies that we're working on. We also manage a lot of projects through energy efficiency programs, Office of Electricity, and then the cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response group. The research focus by site, I've talked about the materials efforts out in Albany, Oregon. We do a lot of our energy conversion type stuff, simulation, based engineering. We have a supercomputer housed at our Morgantown site. We do a lot of process intensification type stuff, decision analysis, and functional type efforts at our Pittsburgh location. And then I mentioned Anchorage, Alaska, and Houston, Texas. Those are our oil and gas field offices. The majority of our research that we do in the laboratory system is early research, talking about the technology readiness level scales 1 through 3, with 9 being commercialization. 1 through 3 is almost like an idea, and then trying to move that to a development stage, which is 4 and 5. We do the majority of our work, not all of it, but the majority of our work in that 1 through 3, 4 through 5 stage, with the end result being hopefully to commercialize these technologies to make our world better, really, from an energy perspective. And I thought it would be necessary to talk about a little bit with partnering, as this is a virtual workshop, really with Africa. We have a toolbox here that we use to partner. In the States, if you were local, we would say, hey, in a non-pandemic situation, we'd welcome you for a site visit, come see our laboratories, meet some of our researchers, have a good face-to-face discussion on interests that are collaborative in nature. And then from there, we would talk about what our opportunities are, our options really for partnership. And a lot of times with international, we tend to go with a cooperative research and development agreement. And it talks about, who owns data rights and who's going to be doing what, and the financial aspect behind the agreement. So long story short, the purpose is I want you to reach out to me as a belly button on behalf of the lab. If there's an interest in a partnership or any ideas for future collaboration, I welcome you to reach out to me, and we can begin discussions on what the topic is, and then really where to take it from there. So here's my contact information at the bottom of the screen, and I thank you for joining us today. We're excited about the next, really today, and then a couple hours tomorrow for this virtual workshop. When we originally had planned this, we had tossed around the idea of hosting this in person in Washington, D.C., and having some site visits in the area, and really make it hands-on and get to know each other a lot better. But since the pandemic hit, that's kind of limited us in the ability to do that. So we've decided to still have the workshop, but to host it virtually. So we're going to make the best of the situation as we can. With that being said, I would like to transition over to our first speaker, which will be the opening remarks from the U.S. government perspectives. And if Landon is there, I will stop sharing my screen and allow Landon, if he has slides, to do so. Thank you.
No slides, Anthony, but a big thank you to you and NETL for hosting this, and also for my team in the Office of African and Middle Eastern Affairs at the Department of Energy, Jim Jewell and Gina Erickson, who helped pull this webinar together. As you mentioned, my name's Landon Darrenson. I'm the Director for African and Middle Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. And greetings to everybody joining us today for this webinar focused on the role of natural gas in Africa's energy mix and what a net zero future might look like for the continent. As many people are probably aware, the United States, as the world's #1 producer and consumer, frankly, of natural gas, knows intimately the benefits and challenges associated with its production, transportation, and use. Natural gas is responsible for approximately 40% of the electricity produced in the United States, and we're the 3rd largest LNG exporter in the world. Frankly, because natural gas is so prolific here, the price of gas in the U.S. is 1/4 of the historic highs that Europe and Asia are experiencing today. But use of natural gas is not without consequence. And during this webinar, as we speak to the merits of deploying natural gas, we'll also be upfront about addressing the challenges natural gas emissions still pose to the health of the world. I anticipate that this is a largely informed audience, but for those not familiar with the natural gas sector, when we're discussing the term natural gas, we're mainly speaking about methane. And methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping heat in the atmosphere. So when methane is not transported or produced in the safest and cleanest way possible, the implications for climate change are troubling to contemplate, especially if use increases dramatically in Africa without proper mitigation and safeguards in place. Rapidly reducing methane emissions is the single most effective strategy to reduce warming over the next 30 years and play a crucial role in keeping to 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of temperature rise. As we head further into the 2020s, there's undoubtedly a role of natural gas will play in several contexts. But we need to be discerning in our analysis and about when and where we deploy those resources. In the United States, we have a goal of achieving a carbon neutral power sector by 2035 and a carbon-free economy by 2050. If we're going to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, we must be especially thoughtful about new gas infrastructure, while still prioritizing the importance of energy access, jobs, and broader economic growth. At the U.S. Department of Energy, we're excited to take that journey with you. DOE's mission is to ensure America's security and prosperity by addressing its energy, environmental, and nuclear challenges through transformative science and technology solutions. As Secretary Granholm is fond of saying, we're the solutions department. It's our job to find ways to work together to apply cutting-edge DOE research into clean energy technologies to adapt to and overcome global energy and climate challenges. In recent years, we've seen natural gas becoming increasingly important internationally as well. This is increasingly true in Africa as the continent begins to transition from fuels with higher greenhouse gas emissions, such as coal, all while meeting an incredible need for energy demand that's growing on this continent, especially given the strong population growth and anticipated economic growth overall. We recognize that Africa has significant natural gas resources as well, making natural gas development an attractive, low-cost, short-term option for some countries, particularly those countries that are oil gas producers. In this regard, we must be clear-eyed about the challenges associated with flared gas and fugitive emissions. This webinar is an opportunity for us to start the discussion, for us to collaborate to ensure natural gas in Africa is harnessed for local use while minimizing the release of methane into the atmosphere and ensuring that emissions such as CO2 are increasingly captured or used or stored safely. Over the course of today, we'll also be exploring the technological solutions so that natural gas can be economically and sustainably used in Africa. Deploying advanced technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, sequestration, battery storage, hydrogen production, and enhanced efficiency technologies to limit emissions of methane and carbon dioxide can have a profound impact on the continent. Finally, let us acknowledge the United States and Africa share many similar challenges regarding the just and inclusive transition of our energy sectors. In the United States, we view the connection between energy and climate as an opportunity to use energy innovation to increase economic growth while decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. The International Finance Corporation estimates that $23 trillion in climate-smart investment opportunities will be available in emerging markets through 2030. This translates into funding opportunities in Africa that can stimulate high-quality energy job growth in clean energy, as well as the opportunity to pass on to the generations that follow us the tools they will need to build a green energy ecosystem of the future. In doing so, Africa can ensure its communities currently dependent on coal jobs can participate in the clean energy transition to ensure no communities are left behind. However, this won't happen if Africa focuses solely on natural gas without building in the flexibilities to use and expand renewable energy and related technologies. The world is moving towards clean energy, and we need Africa to be a part of the transition and to benefit from it. And we want to work with Africa to make it happen. We want to work with you to fuel innovation, drive growth, create jobs, and stimulate country to country, business to business, and people to people cooperation and ties. We want to tackle the dual hurdles of global climate change and COVID recovery that build back better with Africa, because the only way we can truly solve the challenges is working together. So enjoy the webinar. Thank you, and let's get to work.
Okay, thank you, Landon. I do want to say before I give it over to Ryan that we are recording today and tomorrow's session just to use as a future resource. So if anyone has any issues with that, just let us know. We do have the ability to edit things, but I did want to let the group know. I also put it in the chat as well. Ryan, do you have any slides?
No, I do not.
Okay. If you're ready, it's all yours. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Good morning. I'm Ryan P., the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Resource Sustainability in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. I'd like to start by thanking the DOE's International Affairs Office and National Energy Technology Lab for organizing and hosting this important discussion, and for providing me the opportunity to say a few words to you today. DOE and the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management have a strong interest in supporting and partnering with African countries on the important topic of responsible natural gas and how to use this resource during the transition to net zero carbon emissions and a clean energy economy. We recently changed the name of our office to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. This change reflects a significant realignment of the work in our office to focus on carbon management and to minimize the climate and environmental impacts of fossil energy and help achieve the nation's net zero goals by mid-century. Our efforts are aligned to advance the Biden-Harris administration's mission to cut emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030, to produce 100% clean electricity by 2035, and to reach a net zero U.S. carbon economy by 2050. We are also committed to improving the conditions of frontline communities impacted by the legacy of fossil fuel use and ensuring that we address the health, environmental, economic, and climate impacts that affect these communities. Central to this is the role that the office will play in setting the standard for responsible stewardship of the environment, employing meaningful community engagement, and supporting a healthy economic transition that accelerates the growth of good-paying jobs. We have an opportunity to build and deploy important technologies in a better way than we have done previously. Today, coal and natural gas make up 56% of the U.S. electric power sector. Of the 840 gigawatts of coal and natural gas power we rely on today, roughly 75% will reach retirement age by 2035. Both reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and removal of CO2 from legacy emissions from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere will be critical in order to achieving net zero goals, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change emphasizes. Technology approaches like CCS and carbon dioxide removal and methane mitigation will play an enormously important role over the next decade. Decarbonizing the industrial and power sectors will require carbon capture and reliable storage. Of course, avoiding emissions will always be less expensive than having to pull the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And that's what achieving net zero means. For every CO2 molecule we emit, we must pull one back out. So if we have technologies that decarbonize committed power or industrial emissions like cement and steel processing, we must deploy them rather than pay more later to pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere to achieve net zero. Nations, regions, and corporations are all making net zero carbon emissions pledges to address the climate crisis. Net zero carbon goals will not only rely on clean electricity, but also low carbon supply chains for fuels, cement, and steel, which often produce indirect emissions for many corporations. In addition to point source carbon capture, we also need carbon dioxide removal approaches that can permanently remove CO2 from the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. And that's where our direct air capture R&D efforts can play an important role. Once CO2 is captured, the question is, what do you do with it? Our office focuses on solutions centered around reliable and dedicated CO2 storage, either deep underground or in products that scale to the emissions. One of our major demonstration projects is successfully combining carbon capture with steam methane reforming to produce hydrogen. This project, located in Port Arthur, Texas, has stored roughly 7 megatons of CO2 since 2013. And our National Energy Technology Laboratory is part of a research consortium examining the impact of blending hydrogen and natural gas on existing gas infrastructure to support the eventual transition of pipelines that carry 100% hydrogen. So speaking of natural gas, methane emissions can contribute substantially to the greenhouse gas intensity, anywhere from 16 to 65% to the combustion emissions, assuming 100 years. Fuel switching from coal to natural gas roughly cuts CO2 emissions in half. But if the supply chain of that natural gas is not leak tight, the emissions could be greater than coal. So we're focused on making the natural gas supply chain in the U.S. leak tight. We're investing in developing the materials, sensors, and approaches to mitigate methane emissions. And where mitigation through leak detection and prevention is difficult, we'll invest in approaches where that methane may be separated from the air and concentrated or converted to hydrogen or ammonia. We're also working on creating innovative solutions to reduce flaring and venting, including alternative uses for the stranded gas through mobile conversion technologies that can be deployed into the field and either convert that gas to a higher value product or be used as an energy resource in the field or in neighboring communities. The FECM office is also supporting a U.S. government-wide engagement to assist the European Union in developing a methane strategy, and we are sharing technical knowledge on methane mitigation, detection, and quantification, including quantifying methane emissions throughout the LNG supply chain. We hope we can build similar partnerships with countries in other regions. So that's an overview of what we're doing to advance the administration's commitment to meet the climate emergency, promote clean and responsible natural gas, and put in place a sustainable and fair net zero carbon economy. This kind of transformation is always challenging, and it requires collaboration across government, industry, and academia. At DOE, we are committed to working with our partners to advance critical carbon management and clean energy technologies. And we look forward to our continued strong partnership with African nations on these important topics. So I applaud the timeliness and focus that this workshop is covering, and I look forward to supporting future endeavors with you all. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Really appreciate the comments. And with that being said, we'll move forward to our first session. Andrew, the floor is yours to introduce your panel and take it from here. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthony, and very humbled to follow you and Deputy Assistant Secretary Pei, who so eloquently set the stage for today's program. My name is Andrew Palmatier. I'm a program director with the United States Energy Association in Washington, D.C. And I'll be moderating today's panel, today's first panel. For those of you unfamiliar with USEA, we're a nonprofit, non-lobbying institution founded in 1924 and built on two pillars of equal importance. First, we convene, educate, and serve as a key resource for the U.S. and global energy industry. Second, we work in partnership with U.S. government agencies such as the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management to better the lives of people throughout the world by promoting the development of affordable, clean, and reliable energy access for all. USEA has implemented peer-to-peer energy partnerships and technical assistance activities around the world and in sub-Saharan Africa specifically for over 25 years. This work, funded by U.S. government agencies like the Department of Energy, U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Department of State, and also by voluntary contributions from our members, has supported the alleviation of energy poverty and the growth of energy access on the continent through the transfer of best practices in the energy and power sectors. USEA has worked closely with utilities, regulators, and ministries throughout sub-Saharan Africa to increase energy trade, reduce energy costs, and to expand energy access to the hundreds of millions of people who lack it. This work is central to our mission of ensuring affordable, clean, and reliable energy access for all. Today's program, as has been stated already, comes at a critical juncture in the global energy transition and in Africa's energy future. New natural gas discoveries on the continent, along with the growth of global LNG markets, provide unprecedented opportunities to end energy poverty, as well as to enable the further integration of Africa's bountiful, variable, renewable energy resources into the grid by providing flexible baseload power and grid support services. Natural gas can also enable the reduction of harmful emissions in other sectors, such as transportation and industry, improving air quality on an increasingly urbanized continent. However, as highlighted by the recently released IPCC climate report and the speakers before me, we must take into account the manner in which we use natural gas to meet our energy needs. Unabated greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide and methane, could accelerate climate change and threaten our very way of life. The impacts of climate change will be particularly harsh on coastal populations, agricultural communities, and those most vulnerable among us around the world. As an industry, we must come together to accelerate the deployment of technologies, business models, and project finance structures that can drive us to a net zero future. The road to a decarbonized energy future with universal access looks different on a continental and country level. There is no silver bullet. In North America, we're navigating the energy transition primarily through the retirement of old energy assets, improving the efficiency of existing assets, and deploying renewables and new technologies on new build energy infrastructure. Across Africa, we have a different opportunity, a chance to expand energy access through the deployment of new, clean, and net zero energy technologies. Natural gas with maximal emissions abatement can play a key role in Africa's net zero energy future. The challenge of meeting growing energy demand while mitigating the impacts of anthropogenic climate change will require a tremendous effort and coordination of the best and brightest minds our industry has to offer. It will require engineering ingenuity, creative commercial models, sound environmental management, and innovative approaches to project finance. It is not a continental challenge, but one in which we must partner with colleagues and experts from around the globe to share research, best practices, and accelerate new technology deployment. We're very fortunate to have here today a few of those brilliant minds who are working to develop Africa's plentiful energy resources in a sustainable and responsible manner. The three panelists joining me today are all experts in African energy development, and we'll be coming together to discuss the title of this panel, Challenges and Opportunities for a Net Zero Future in Africa. Our first panelist, Wale Shonibare, has over 3 decades experience spanning Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa in investment banking and consulting. He joined the African Development Bank in 2017 as the inaugural director responsible for energy financial solutions, policy, and regulation. The Financial Solutions team has since established itself as a leading transactions team across Africa, having undertaken several mandated lead arranger roles and facilitated total investment of approximately $29 billion in numerous projects, ranging from solar PV, concentrated solar, hydroelectric dams, gas-fired power plants, LNG facilities, battery storage solutions, and geothermal energy plants. The Policy, Regulation, and Statistics team has, under his leadership, launched well-acclaimed flagship initiatives such as the Electricity Regulatory Index to improve the enabling environment for private sector investment in the energy sector. Wale is currently a non-executive director on the board of the Africa Guarantee Fund and an advisory board member of the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund and Inspired Evolution Investment Management, respectively. Prior to joining the African Development Bank, he held various senior management level positions at investment banks and consulting organizations in the UK, the UAE, and Nigeria. Wale holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Civil Engineering from Glasgow University and an MBA from Imperial College, University of London. Wale, I believe you're with us here, so I think you have some slides to share with you. And please, everyone, join me in virtually welcoming Wale to the virtual stage. Wale, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good morning or good afternoon to colleagues, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk very briefly about the challenges and opportunities for a net zero future in Africa, particularly as it relates to gas. So why are we talking about this? Why is this a concern? We all know that we have a climate emergency. So human activity has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in thousands of years, leading to widespread, intensifying and rapid changes in the world's weather patterns. So we're seeing higher CO2 levels, sea level rises, Arctic ice melting, glaciers retreating. And what does that mean for the world? Extreme heat, heavy rainfalls, drought, fires, and ocean warming. Now, this has had significant implications for Africa. You know, Africa, despite being the least polluting continent in the world, suffers the disproportionate impact of climate change. So African countries need to prepare for significant shifts in their ecosystems and biodiversity, which will negatively impact the economic sectors and livelihoods that depend on them. We're already seeing a lot of this across Africa, leading to more fragility in our countries, more civil wars, and local unrest. So how does Africa grow despite many of these concerns? I think it's important when it comes to Africa's energy needs, which are urgent or growing, to look at the different ways in which we're considering the energy issue in Africa. So there are consumption growth drivers. First of all, 2.1 billion people will live in Africa in 2040, up from 1.3 billion in 2020. 59% of the population will live in urban areas by 2050. 43% increase in manufacturing by 2030. 2.3% growth in household consumption by 2030. 100% increase in electricity demand by 2040. So this is a growing continent. It's a very young continent, and we have to have the energy to support Africa's industrialization. But the picture varies depending on where you look in Africa. In North Africa, there's a significant need to decarbonize the grid because a lot of the energy production is from gas. In Southern Africa, it's mainly coal. And in West Africa, there's also gas resources. But if we look at East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, excluding gas, we'll see that the grids there and the energy mix there is largely led by renewable energy. There's significant hydro resources as well as geothermal in countries such as Kenya, Ethiopia, and Central Africa has significant amount of rainfall. So the hydro resources, are quite strong. But if we're going to achieve universal access by 2030, Africa's energy production must grow by 150% to reach this goal. So if we look at Africa's emission profile, it's different from the rest of the world. Africa to date has marginally contributed to global greenhouse emissions and presents an energy sector that is not as polluting. So historically, Africa's contributions to global emissions has been about 3%. And if we look at where those emissions come from, it's largely driven by 4 countries: South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria. again, if we look at what's causing the emissions, you'll find that compared with the rest of the world, where energy contributes about 76% to emissions, in Africa, the picture looks a bit different. In fact, it's actually land use change and forestry, as well as agriculture, that is driving most of the emissions, around 52%. Energy is only around 39%, but growing, we admit. So when we talk about net zero for Africa, it's also important that we find ways of addressing issues around land use change in forestry, destruction of forests, cutting down of woodlands for firewood, etc., and some of the agricultural practices. That's just as important as looking at the energy issue. So renewables obviously will play a very important role in Africa's pathway to net zero. African countries, however, cannot rely solely on renewable energy to power their economies. Luckily, Africa has abundant resources of renewable energy. The figures are there on the screen for solar and wind. But we know that in order to anchor this variable renewable energy, you need to have solid baseload. And that solid baseload will be provided by gas as well as other means such as hydro, etc. But when looking at fossil fuels, gas is probably definitely the least polluting of the options that Africa has. In getting more renewables onto the grids, obviously, we have to look at the instability that these variable renewable sources can cause, and the load balancing challenges which we've seen in some parts of Africa. And one thing that many commentators also ignore is the cost of actually anchoring more renewables. So if you look at the levelized cost of electricity, you'll find that in places like Kenya, where the bank was involved in financing the largest wind project on the continent, the Lake Turkana project, you'll find that as a result of renewables and variable renewable energy getting onto the grid there, we've had to incur system costs, in order to stabilize the grid, amounting to almost $50 million per year since 2013. So it's not as easy as just doing renewables, and it's important that we open up the debate for countries to realize the implications of bringing more renewables onto their grids. As we said, gas has many uses, and these are all areas that will have to grow for Africa to industrialize. So you have the industrial uses, logistics, commercial, residential, and Africa has to be able to harness its gas resources to deploy in all of these different areas. In terms of stranded assets, there's a lot of debate about whether we should be funding more gas assets at this point. It's encouraging to see the amount of research being led by the American government into these issues, because the key thing is that we're able to convert our gas assets to allow new forms of energy, such as hydrogen, to be able to use those gas assets so that these assets do not become stranded. So natural gas plays this anchoring role because of the flexibility it allows to ramp up, to switch on and off during periods when there's no wind or there's no sun. And the continued reduction in natural gas prices that we've seen, apart from the most recent spike in Europe, is also driving affordability for customers. We're seeing that because gas plants can also be built more quickly, typically For a hydroelectric dam, it could take 10 years to plan. So that also improves the attraction that we're seeing with gas. And from the statistics that we have from the US, for every 1% increase in natural gas capacity, we've seen renewable power generation also increase by 0.88%. So both actually go hand in hand. So it's not either or. If we look at, again, some statistics that we've seen from around the world, we've all seen the statistic about natural gas having between 40% to 57% less emissions than coal. And there's a lot of coal to gas switching that has been going on around the world, United States, China, Europe, India, rest of the world. And you could see the significant progress that has been made, particularly in places such as the US, in replacing coal generation with gas generation. So as a way of reducing emissions and decarbonizing the grid. The good news for Africa, though, is that 40% of the natural gas discoveries between 2011 and 2018 were in 6 African countries. So there's abundant gas resources in countries such as, Nigeria, Mozambique, Southern Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, etc., that will lead the switch to gas in Africa over the coming years. So to wrap up, African Development Bank is a premier development finance institution in Africa, and there are several ways in which we are helping to support the development of gas as a transition fuel to facilitate the pathways for African countries towards net zero. So in terms of helping government with their long-term planning strategies, within their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, program planning, capacity building with regulators and officials. We're supporting project preparation and project investments, helping governments prepare projects in a safe way, taking care of around all the social and environmental safeguards. And but we're also very specific around the instances in which we're going to be supporting gas. So we're not supporting gas exploration and production. A lot of the support is midstream infrastructure, and particularly where those projects are consistent with the Paris Agreement of the countries and consistent with the nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies. And gas projects must be able to demonstrate that they will lead to improved energy access, improved energy security, as well as have positive impacts while promoting technologies and models for maximizing local content. So with that, I think I'll wrap up my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Wale, for the insightful presentation and an overview of the African Development Bank's work and future vision for its role in developing gas infrastructure. I will remind all of our attendees that you can submit any questions for all of our panelists through the chat, the WebEx chat feature. We will hold questions until the end, and we'll take all questions after all 3 panelists have had the chance to speak. So with that, I'd like to turn over to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Bertrand de Laborde, Director of Energy and Mining for the International Finance Corporation. Bertrand has more than 25 years of experience in infrastructure finance and has been playing a leading role in the development of innovative and landmark public-private partnerships in all 5 continents. After 4 years with the French development agency Proparco, and 11 years with Société Générale in Paris, where he was a managing director, head of infrastructure project finance for EMEA, Bertrand joined IFC in 2007. From 2010 to 2018, he has been heading IFC's Africa infrastructure team, which has tripled its activity under his leadership. Since November 2018, he is the director heading the IFC Global Energy, Mining, and Advisory teams. Bertrand is an engineer, graduated from the École Centrale de Paris, one of the top French scientific schools. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today, Bertrand, and I will turn it over to you. It looks like your slides are ready to go, so thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Look, it's a pleasure to be here, and my task is fairly easy because I very much align with what Wale just presented. So I'm going to try to complement it with some additional concrete data, perspective, and perhaps a few examples. So let's go. First, in terms of setting the scene, just to stress that I think we are aware, but it's worth reminding ourselves of the challenges when we talk about energy in Africa. A lot of progress has been achieved over the last 20 years, but still we are falling short. We are falling short, as we know, in terms of access. More than 500 million people in Africa, as of today, still do not have access to electricity. When they have, the quality of service is often poor, with a lot of power cuts, fluctuating grids. The cost is often high, both for customers, but also because we have utilities which often do not work so well. Also for the government, we often end up with significant deficit and a budgetary cost which can be as high as 2 or 3% of GDP each year, which has to be paid by the government. A lot of losses also in the network. So what does that mean? That means that it's not the main topic of this presentation today, but we feel that we should not underestimate the importance of what you see at the top right side of this slide, which is the reform of sector, in terms of sector policy, in terms of utility governance and management, both from the technical standpoint, financial. That's really key. It's something that a number of our institutions, US, NCC also are focusing on, but it's absolutely key. From there, sure, and that's more what we are focusing on today. You need in Africa to increase generation capacity to meet this unserved demand and the growing population. And to do so, again, one should not forget about the grid. Shore of grid solutions are attractive and can help a lot, in particular in a remote area, and there are a lot in Africa. But the traditional grid is also something that we must continue to develop and not forget. So, having said this background, let's move, again, consistent with what Wale was mentioning, perhaps looking at it from another angle and stressing how it's important to keep these numbers into perspective before jumping to any type of conclusion. Overall, worldwide, we know that electricity and heat do represent roughly 30% of CO2 emission, electricity 25% and 6% for heat. But now, from a geographical standpoint, where does it come from? 31% from high-income country, 2/3 from middle-income country, and 3% only from what we call IDA countries in the World Bank classification, which are the poorest country, mainly Africa. 3%. So, what we know now, if beyond region, we look in terms of technology. As we all know, coal is the main issue there. 37% of power worldwide is generated by coal, 37, but in terms of emissions, it's 72%. So that, and also we had that in one of the slides of Wale. We know that per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour, coal is producing twice as much CO2 than gas. And in terms of air pollution, the difference is even more striking. Not to say that gas is entirely clean, obviously, no, but there is a significant difference between the two. And we know about, the impact of coal, particularly in Asia. The next slide is, okay, what has happened over the last 10 years? What you see on the right side of the slide is, so regarding high-income countries, the total generation has more or less remained stable thanks to a better energy efficiency. The increase in demand at the end was met with a pretty flat generation. What has significantly changed is a mix of energy sources. As you see on this chart, is much less coal, more gas, and more renewable energy. largely under market conditions, making coal more expensive as compared to these other sources, as well, obviously, as deliberate policy making, in particular in Europe. Now, if you move to the middle part of the slide, you see what happened in a middle-income country in the same time. Very significant increase in power generation, which is entirely logical. These countries are catching up in terms of economic growth, but much more problematic is the energy mix. Great, we see this increase in renewable, significant one, but what we see is first and foremost this huge increase in coal, which is more than twice what has gone, the amount by which it has gone down in high-income countries, so completely offsetting the gain that were done on that side. And now, if we move to the left side, IDA, so Africa mainly, that's where you see that you do not see much. First, it's so little. You really see that if we think in terms of, again, power generation, climate, CO2 emission, of the last 10 years, it's clearly not where it has happened and where the issue has been increased. And going forward, looking at it perhaps also with the concept of energy justice, this slide may be a bit complex at first glance, but it's in fact fairly easy. The size of the bubble is the size of the issue in terms of CO2 emissions. So you see, no surprise how big it's in China, to some extent also in North America, growing in India. But then you move to the two axes, which try to give you, okay, sure, let's talk about the size of emission in absolute terms, but let's also, and perhaps first, look at it per capita, electricity generation per capita and CO2 emission per capita to have a sense of justice here. And what you realize in particular, if you focus on CO2 emissions per capita, is that, yep, no surprise, North America is still high, Japan too, Eastern Europe, and China. China has gone up a lot. India is still much lower, but going up pretty quickly. Now, what about Sub-Saharan Africa? Excluding South Africa, here we are all conscious, and the South Africa government, first and foremost, that there is a significant issue in terms of decarbonization and coal usage with a number of old coal power plants in South Africa. But putting South Africa aside, in the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, which is around 1.1 billion people, what you see that we are nowhere in terms of electricity generation per capita or CO2 emission per capita, absolutely nowhere. And we are not at the risk in 10 years from now to wake up with a situation like China or even India in Nigeria. We are starting from such a low base that obviously, and that's now what I'm going to move to, we have to be very mindful to find the best path, the best way to bring power to Africa. We have to do it in a sustainable way. But just to flag that in terms of where we start and where we may be in 10 years from now, it has nothing to do with Asia. So now about what to do with that. Our view is that in line with these facts and figures, while the climate problem is real and is a worldwide one, we have very different situations and challenges depending on continents, and we should come up with different type of solutions. One, which we should always start with everywhere, it's about managing demand. I mentioned that, be it in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of demand side management, and in terms of reducing losses in grids and so on. Particularly in Africa, to some extent also in South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, where we can lose as much as 20–30% of energy in the grid. On top of that, you also have commercial losses, non-billed energy, which can be another 10–20%. So that's the first way to optimize energy use and to have a sustainable power sector in terms of emission. Energy access, as mentioned in Africa, it has to remain the absolute priority. It's number two. Phasing out coal, to a large extent, this climate war in the energy space in the next 10 years will largely be won or lost in Asia, and in terms of what we do in terms of phasing out coal. Something that is important in South Africa, absolutely, but pretty irrelevant in the rest of the continent. And in terms of goals, absolutely, boosting renewable energy. It's a key part of the solution, whatever the continent is. So it has to do in terms of bringing more wind and solar. But let's, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, do not forget that we first have also to work on grids and on utilities. If we have completely bankrupt utilities and mismanaged power sector, it will be very hard to do that. So the same figures, putting them again in perspective, that's about these 500 million people in Africa who are still lacking access, while in the same time of the last 20 years in the rest of the world, particularly in Asia, the number of unconnected people has really gone down by a dramatic proportion, but that has not so much happened in Africa. And on the right side, it's again, that's to put things into perspective, in terms of CO2 emissions coming from the power sector, which we know is around 25% worldwide of all CO2 emissions, sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa today, is 0.5%. 0.5% of it for a population of 1.1 billion. And if we were, which will not happen for many reasons, but if we were to say, okay, let's in the next couple of years, increase all generation capacity in all of sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa, by 50% with gas only, it would increase CO2 emission from Africa from 0.5% of the total worldwide to 0.9%, so still pretty insignificant. And while it touched on that, so what we do feel is that, so as mentioned, renewable energy is really what we want to start with. So particularly solar, there is a tremendous potential in the continent. The prices, as we all know, are going down. We are starting to see some projects using some battery. As we know, it's not yet fully economical, but we are getting there. So renewable energy and solar in particular is really the first kind of port of entry for us and what we want to maximize. We have, for these reasons, develop initiative like scaling solar in Africa to try to really boost that technology and that market in the continent. Now, as Wale was mentioning, we also need to have base load, and we need flexible base load to help integrate more renewable energy, and that's what large hydro and gas can do. I'm mentioning large hydro because we have to be mindful of and focused on environmental and social aspects on large hydro, but we really feel that it's the type of project that we have to continue doing, and there is a very significant potential in Africa, particularly in Central Africa, in Cameroon, in Gabon, Congo, DRC, in Eastern Africa too, as well as in Western Africa, in a country like Guinea and around. And gas. And we also see a very interesting point, which is the complementarity between the potential for hydropower and gas-fired generation, with a lot of gas in Mozambique, obviously, Nigeria, but also some other countries from Tanzania, Angola, and Senegal, where a lot of gas resources has been discovered recently. An example for us is in Mozambique, we are in the process in the last mile of the marathon to close a 450 megawatt gas-fired power plant, Temane, with an English sponsor, Lobelec. And it's a case in point. In Mozambique, as of today, the total installed capacity is around 1,000 megawatts for a population of 30 million people, and we have only 1/3 of that population who is connected, only 1/3. And this 1,000 megawatts, it's more than half of it today is hydro. There is some gas, and there is already a bit of solar. So in Mozambique, again, we want to continue pushing hard on this renewable energy potential. We, IFC, have financed the first solar deal in Mozambique, but we also do see that first, in terms of power sector as of today and CO2 emission, it's close to zero. It will still be zero in 10 years from now. And the 450 megawatts that Temane will bring will not change anything when you look at the population of the country in terms of CO2 emission, but it will bring tremendous benefit in terms of access, and also possibly some of it may be exported to South Africa, helping to replace this, contributing to replace some of these coal-fired power plants. So that's about Mozambique, and now let's move to my last slide, sorry, trying to summarize key messages. So in sub-Saharan Africa, really, it's first and foremost about ensuring access with affordable, reliable, sustainable energy. We will have to do that in a pragmatic way, using different type of business model. In particular, off-grid solutions are very attractive in some countries or remote areas. We do not believe that it will allow us to leapfrog, to do without the grid, to do without base load. But it's a very interesting tool in the kit. And do not forget about traditional grid development. This energy transition will rely primarily on renewable energy and particularly solar in Africa. But we will need to continue, at least for this coming decade, as a transition to use large hydropower and flexible gas generation, both to provide baseload and to help in terms of stability and intermittency of the grid, which is the point number 4. And the point number 5, I had started with that, but I will close and leave it with there. It's the importance of continuing to push for reforms to improve the management and the situation of the utilities and power sector. With that, handing back over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. Excellent presentation, and I think follows and pairs very well with what we've heard from Wale as well. So we'll come back to you after for the Q&A session after our third presentation. Thank you again for your excellent remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our third panelist today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lilio Odarno. Lilio Odarno is the director of the Africa Energy and Climate Innovation Program at the Clean Air Task Force. She leads the organization's efforts to address the dual need of expanding affordable energy in developing economies and also building a decarbonized global energy system. Lily's work focuses on Africa's energy transition, utility viability, and technology innovation for the low-carbon development in Africa. She held previous positions at the World Resources Institute, where she established and led the Institute's first energy access initiative in East Africa, and the United Nations Environment Program DTU partnership in Denmark. She serves on the editorial board of the Climate Policy Journal. Lily holds a Bachelor in Science degree in Biological Sciences from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana, a Master of Science in Engineering and Environmental Management from the Aalborg University in Denmark. We'll let them keep their university and not try to annex it, pardon me, and a PhD in energy and environmental policy from the University of Delaware. Lily, I believe you will not be using slides, but I see that you are with us now, so please join me on the virtual stage and I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Andrew, and really good to be here with you all today. And many thanks to the former panelists who have done a really great job of setting the stage and making my job really easy this morning. I've been tasked with speaking and just reflecting on the topic before us today, the challenges and opportunities of a net zero future in Africa, specifically looking at how we think of innovating for a net zero future in Africa and how the US DOE can support that process. So I think that Wale and Bertrand have done a good job in setting the stage and helping us understand the context of energy access and natural gas in Africa. So I will just build on those points a bit. I think clearly we realize that Africa has had a long-standing natural gas industry, even though it was previously really dominated by 6 major producers: Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, and Angola. We are really seeing a growth in the industry with the recent natural gas discoveries in northern Mozambique, in southern Tanzania, and along the Gulf of Guinea. So Africa certainly anticipates a growth in its natural gas industry. And at the same time, fossil fuel exports are a significant source of revenue for hydrocarbon-rich countries in Africa. So for sub-Saharan Africa alone, up to 50% of our import value comes from fossil fuel exports. And in terms of power provision, since the early 2000s, we have also seen a growing number of African countries, particularly those in Western and Central Africa, turning more and more to the domestic use of natural gas for dispatchable power. This means that the challenge of decarbonizing the global energy system to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change really has serious implications for African economies, especially those that depend on natural gas to support their economies and the energy systems. So you take the largest economy on the continent, Nigeria, it falls right into this bracket. And there are really growing concerns about what the impact of the dwindling natural revenues in these hydrocarbon dependent economies could be as we navigate the energy transition. There is also, on the other hand, a school of thought which really has been postulating that as we see a growth in renewable energy markets, we are going to see a corresponding growth in demand for energy mineral commodities, so talking about nickel, about copper and cobalt, and that these could potentially create export opportunities for some of Africa's fossil fuel dependent economies. Now, the truth is that while some countries in the region could benefit from this potential shift, for many countries, especially those with the greatest dependence on natural resource exports in Africa, hydrocarbon earnings will still exceed mineral revenues. And this is true for several countries. It's true for Equatorial Guinea, it's true for Congo-Brazzaville, it's true for Sudan, it's true for Mozambique, it's true for Cameroon. So what this means is that a decline in the global hydrocarbon demand will be disruptive for these economies. And I make these initial comments because I think it's very important for us to navigate Africa's net zero future with this context in mind. I think that it helps us to place the challenge of decarbonizing Africa's natural gas sector in its proper place. And it helps us and guides us to weave together what we could call a more pragmatic and equitable plan of action for the hydrocarbon dependent economies in Africa, especially those south of the Sahara, where we have a lot of our least developed countries concentrated. So what I want to do this morning is really just to reflect on, three points, which I want to think about them as, initial thoughts and initial ideas about, what principles could be guiding us as we think about decarbonizing Africa's natural gas sector. I think that the broader context is the fact that for a lot of countries on the continent, what we have to navigate is not just a climate transition or a climate challenge, but coupling that with development needs and the dire need to lift many people out of poverty. So how do we navigate that? So the first principle that I would share today is what I call the principle of shared responsibility. And basically, I think building on the fact that the transition to a zero carbon economy will not happen overnight. Oil and gas are going to likely remain important parts of our energy systems for several years. And I think that because of this, the burden to decarbonize the natural gas sector in Africa must not be left to the African countries alone, most of whom will be balancing development needs and decarbonization goals. The biggest consumers of Africa's hydrocarbon resources, primarily the European Union and China, I think we need to begin thinking seriously about how these economies work with African producing countries to decarbonize the sector. The World Bank has a great initiative, the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Partnership, which is now beginning to include this consumer angle in the gas flaring reduction efforts. So what they're trying to do now is really looking at the imported flare gas index, which allows countries to identify the flaring intensity of their crude oil imports. And initial analysis is already showing that the countries with the highest imported flare intensity are those that are importing from the high flaring countries. So in Africa, we are talking about Nigeria, Algeria, Libya. And we could take this a bit further and say that, we need to get these countries to share in the responsibility of decarbonizing the carbon intensive parts of the life cycle of the products that they consume. And this could potentially be a win-win situation if we think of the fact that the global nature of the climate crisis implies that carbon emissions matter regardless of where those emission reductions are achieved. And so we really need to begin thinking about collaborative action and shared responsibility between both importing and exporting countries as we navigate the transition. I think getting some of the high consumer countries in the European Union to commit to working with their African counterparts to address routine flaring through transparent, measurable, and trackable actions could be a very successful outcome of the upcoming climate negotiations. So that's the first point on shared responsibility. Second, I would say that the net zero by 2050 targets of a lot of the natural gas producing companies must include emission reduction targets in their Africa operations. So many global companies are big investors in Africa's natural gas markets, and they really have played a big role in transforming the sector. We've seen that in Egypt, where Eni's discovery of the Zoe gas fields dramatically changed the face of the country's LNG market. BP and Cosmos Energy are looking at producing gas in Senegal and Mauritania by 2023. Chevron, Eni, Total, and BP are working with Sonangol in Angola, are looking at investing up to 12 billion in an integrated LNG project in Angola. Total and Shell remain big players in Nigeria's LNG market. And the good thing is that many of these large global players have announced net zero by 2050 targets. And I believe that these targets must be backed by clear, transparent, and measurable actions to cut emissions in their Africa operations. And so I think that as the European Union and the United States begin to debate methane emissions mandates, and these mandates could apply to the operations of the US and European natural gas companies operating in Africa. Methane leak detection and repairs, as well as looking at monitoring, reporting, and verification of emissions in Africa operations could be a key part of that. And I think this way we could actually see emissions reductions being realized in Africa at potentially lower cost for these companies, but then without having to place that extra burden on African governments, so they have to basically go back to dig into their national coffers to pay for these emissions reductions. So that's my second point. The third one will really look a bit at, how do we think about what the US DOE could support, or how the US DOE could potentially support. And basically, I would say that what natural gas dependent African economies need is the right menu of options to grow their energy systems and economies within climate limits. I think that it's not enough for us to say that we need to decarbonize without us presenting a viable menu of options. And I think that developing this menu of options could potentially be a potential area of support, both for the DOE, but also for some of the multilateral financial institutions who are beginning to rethink and redefine their fossil fuel investment portfolios. I think that one of the key areas that we need to focus on strongly in this era is really the need for strong research and innovation agenda on the African continent to support the net zero gas strategy for the continent. And this would really encompass a range of options, both from including carbon and methane management, but also looking at developing zero carbon firm power alternatives. And this is important because for countries who are currently dependent on natural gas as a source of dispatchable power, we will need to begin thinking or begin planning for and investing in what a zero carbon firm power alternative could be for those countries. Even though we see potential for wind, solar, and storage, and even though we recognize that these options could potentially have a significant or account for a significant share of Africa's future energy systems, they are intermittent and they are also unlikely to alone meet the growing needs of the economies as they industrialize. And so we need a strong research agenda. We need to invest in innovation and research on the continent, looking into zero carbon firm power options and building the capacities of African countries, of local institutions, local researchers, to engage actively in developing and implementing these alternative technologies as they become cost-effective and feasible for African markets. And I think that the same notion applies to the replacement of oil and non-gas application and non-power gas applications as well, especially in some of the hard-to-abate sectors. I think that another area where potential US DOE support could be helpful is really looking at exploring deeper what the potential for carbon management in Africa is, both focusing on the technical feasibility, but also looking at the policy drivers that can support carbon management in natural gas-rich economies on the continent. And linked to that, I think we need to begin thinking seriously also about how we invest in data gathering on methane emissions along the natural gas life cycle. And this will give us a better understanding of what the potential role of natural gas as a transition fuel is, and can also help to provide the necessary evidence to support the shared responsibility for methane emissions reductions in both the producer and consumer countries, especially as methane becomes an important item on the list of the discussions that we are having so far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. And I think that my final point on the how we support innovation is that as interest grows in Africa, potentially serving as a hub for hydrogen exports to Europe, I think now is the right time for African countries to begin examining if this is even an appropriate path for them. So could Africa's natural gas economies become producers of blue and green hydrogen? We do need deeper research on a country-by-country basis, looking at the opportunities and pathways to help us understand the economic viability of this option for African countries or regions, but also to help us understand the infrastructural and policy needs that could or would be needed to support such a market. And doing this sooner rather than later, I think is critical for is a critical research agenda for the African continent as we deepen discussions around the role of hydrogen, Africa as a potential hub for hydrogen exports. So to round up, I would say that even though technology is great, we also always have to be mindful of the fact that successful decarbonization and development on the African continent will require much more than just technical fixes. And I think many my other panelists have alluded to this, that we still need to pay close attention to having functional utilities and really well-functioning and regionally integrated markets. These will be critical for well-functioning power and energy markets overall. And linked to that, thinking about how we boost demand by stimulating productive use of energy as we build out Africa's energy systems and markets. And so I will close on that point and look forward to engaging with you all in the Q&A. Thank you, and back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Lily, for an excellent speech and a clear three-pillar approach to decarbonization while also expanding energy access in Africa. If I could please ask Wale and Bertrand to join us again on camera, we'll move into the question and answer session. I will reiterate as well for our audience that you're please welcome to submit any questions that you have through the WebEx chat feature, either to the entire group or individually to me. I'll keep an eye on the chat box as we go. But I'd like to start off with a question that both Bertrand and Lily touched upon, the concept of leapfrogging. Now, Bertrand, you mentioned that leapfrogging alone will not be enough to develop or create universal energy access in Africa. But what I'd like to ask you is, do you see opportunities in particularly emissions control technologies or cleaner power systems for leapfrogging? And could you talk a little bit about, in the African context, where we might see technological advances driving us towards a net zero path, even if that alone is not enough to meet energy demand needs? And Bertrand, I'm sorry, I believe you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I was mentioning there is quite a lot in your questions. Perhaps first on the leapfrogging to for the sake of clarity, what I was aiming at here is this concept which is very attractive, but I feel a bit of a rosy one, that to electrify Africa we can leapfrog the grid, leapfrog all the traditional technology and essentially go with only solar and off-grid. And that I find is in some ways a very attractive narrative, but unfortunately it's a narrative which does not work and which does not give justice to Africa and energy needs from Africa. That's, as I mentioned, it's going to be a very interesting, it is already a very interesting part of the solution, a very interesting tool in our kit. We IFC, as Africa Development Bank is doing, we now have several really interesting off-grid projects in various countries. We started long ago in Senegal, but we have now is it off-grid or distributed generation of commercial and industrial? We have this in Nigeria. We are in the process with a sponsor like Scatec to develop that in various African countries. So it's a very interesting tool, but it's not going to be sufficient by far. We will need still for the next decade at least the grid and some traditional technology. Now on the second part of your question, the first thing was really to, as compared to where we were 5 or 10 years ago, to do a big push to see solar energy happening in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was a paradox, that there is a huge potential, but for many years we were seeing a number of potential projects being signed, memorandum of understandings in many countries, but at the end, nothing happening. So that's the reason why on the IFC side, we came up with this Scaling Solar initiative to try through a standardized process, bids, to show that it could also happen in Africa. What we are seeing in some other regions was possible here, and it has happened. It has happened in Zambia, in Senegal, and now we are rolling it out in Côte d'Ivoire, in Niger, in Togo, and other countries. And it has been part of what has demonstrated that you can do it in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one. The second, really, in terms of the latest on new technology, we see that the deployment of battery is going to be very interesting. Again, we should not kind of jump in a rosy picture that all of a sudden battery is going to fix everything, but it's part of the solution. And we are starting to see, for now, usually with some degree of concessional finance, some projects which do embed some battery to mitigate this intermittency issue, and at times also beyond the intermittency or the grid frequency to bring power earlier in the morning or later in the day when the sun is not shining so much. In that respect, and I will end up there, what we are currently seeing in South Africa is very interesting. They have this program which is technology neutral with bids that they have submitted, and a number of projects which have been awarded to various companies with a mix of solar, wind, some degree of thermal and battery. We really see this innovation happening there in South Africa.
Thank you. And Lily and Wale, I'd open the question up to you as well, if you'd like to perhaps expand or give your thoughts on the opportunities for leapfrogging in new technologies or in grid management technologies, and how that might present opportunities in Africa.
Thanks again, Andrew. I think there's no doubt that given what's happening right now, Africa will be looking to industrialize along a different pathway that we've seen in the rest of the world, because technology will be there, and like we've seen with mobile phones, etc., you can take advantage of those technologies. And we're already seeing that in relation to energy access, where you are combining the mobile money technologies with the solar home systems to create a commercial opportunity for many entrepreneurs. And suddenly you find that you go from selling them one solar panel and a light bulb to selling them televisions and fridges, and those companies evolve from being just solar home system companies to service companies for home appliances, and you're creating a credit history for these new consumers, often bottom of the pyramid consumers, and they can grow from that because they'll be able to leverage that credit history that has been established to get loans for other things. So that's very exciting, and the amount of money that's going into fintech in Africa right now is also very exciting, because you can link that up with what's happening in energy access. And the other thing is that what's going on with hydrogen. If you look at North Africa, and to some extent Southern Africa, where you have these large projects that are now under discussion in North Africa about exporting green hydrogen to Europe. And there are companies that are now looking to establish high voltage transmission networks that would allow electricity to be exported to Europe from Africa. Now, those countries start to gain an immense amount from being able to use their significant resources of renewable energy, solar and wind, to satisfy a demand that is growing for green hydrogen. What's also happening in terms of minerals to manufacture things like batteries and all of these other new technologies that we're going to need to enable the transition. Africa has significant deposits of these, and if properly harnessed, also create opportunities. So the transition is a significant opportunity for Africa. We just need to get the regulations in place and build the capacities within government to ensure that they're able to take advantage of these opportunities that will allow the continent to grow in along a greener pathway than and a lot of financial institutions, including ourselves, have not financed coal projects for many years, and the direction is certainly moving away from coal, so moving more towards cleaner forms of energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Wale. And Lily, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is that I think that what is needed really is the pragmatism about what Africa's energy transition would look like. And I think this is where we see a growing need for a country-by-country assessment and understanding of what these unique transition pathways will be. Because I think that a lot of the discussions about leapfrogging assume that certain technologies will be silver bullets across the continent, but This is a continent with very diverse countries and with very unique resource endowments, and who are really starting or are embarking on this the energy transition journey from very different starting points. And so I do think that we need a real emphasis on understanding what the options are on a country by country level, based on our understanding of what the unique pathways for those individual countries are. And I think that is going to help us to understand, what technologies are going to make sense for these countries. For some of these countries, we are going to have some fossil fuels will be around for a while, and we need to think about how do we do emissions control in a cost-effective way? In other countries, it may not apply, and we may be able to quickly shift to other zero carbon sources. How do we build a foundation for that? So I do think that really emphasizing that country by country assessment and understanding of the unique transition pathways will be a key ingredient for this.
Well, thank you all. And I think, Lily, that's an excellent point to end that question on, because too often from a Western perspective, we look at Africa as a monolith and a single continent. But as you point out, it's a continent with very diverse topography, natural resources, economic contexts in different countries. And so it really does have to be approached on a country by country basis. I would like to now turn to a question that was submitted from the audience. So we've seen in the news recently about carbon neutral or zero carbon LNG shipments, going out. And do you see a role or an opportunity for zero carbon LNG in Africa, in African gas markets? And I'll add on to that. If so, is there any particular market in which you see a potential or an opportunity for the deployment or consumption of zero carbon LNG?
So is this addressed to anybody? Or? Right. Okay. I'll chip in here. Certainly, I think one of the things we're going to see is that as countries bring in carbon pricing, and Europe is working on a carbon pricing mechanism, you'll find that there will be a need to decarbonize exports. And so for any country that is looking to export to different parts of the world, the Chinese have also brought in their own carbon pricing methodology, although these are subsidized to a significant extent now, but over time, they will affect the ability of many countries around the world to export into these major markets. So if you are an LNG producer in Nigeria or Mozambique, if you want to export into Europe, or factories that are selling products into Europe, you would have to have, find a way of making zero carbon LNG. Otherwise, you'll be at a disadvantage. And South Africa is facing a massive issue right now, given its manufacturing base, car manufacturing, etc., because those exports are going to become very expensive very soon, unless they can find a way to decarbonize. Thank you.
Maybe on my, you want to go?
Yeah, I was just gonna say very briefly that I do think that zero carbon LNG will be possible. It will take time based on which countries we are talking about. I think that for some of the countries who are, Nigeria is in the top 7 flaring countries in the world, and we need to really begin thinking about how we work on this flaring intensity and bring that down. And that's why I actually kind of mentioned the point about thinking about this as shared responsibility. I think that if countries feel that the burden of decarbonizing their energy systems are really just left on them alone as they try to navigate other pressing development needs as well, then it becomes a bigger burden for them. But it's certainly possible for that to happen, especially in some of the new entrants. So thinking about the recent discoveries, whether it's in Mozambique, in Tanzania, as they build out these systems, I think we do have an opportunity for them to follow a lower carbon development pathway. But it's certainly not going to be easy because of the cost involved in doing it. Of course, some of the methane leak detection technologies and actually addressing them are not so expensive and could actually be done quickly and effectively. So those are low-hanging fruits that countries can begin adopting. But I do think that it's a pathway that is possible. It will take time for some countries and less time for other countries to do so.
Maybe on my end, I'm just compliment stressing that what Lily mentioned earlier, which is that each country is different, and we have to have a different roadmap and a pragmatic one for each country, depending on their energy situation, how much you still need to add to ensure access, what is the natural endowment of the country, what type of resources you have. So each situation is different. From that standpoint, on gas, where the case is stronger is in these countries where, again, you are already using, but you are reaching some limit in terms of solar, in terms of wind, in terms of hydro, and then you have local gas. Local gas is obviously the ideal situation, and that's then what you have in Mozambique, in Nigeria, where reducing flaring is obviously the first priority, or what we are now, or with what we will soon have in Senegal with this local gas reserve. In terms of LNG, obviously the case is a bit harder to make because you have to import it. So be it in terms from an economic standpoint or from a climate standpoint, it's a bit harder. But we see some situation like in South Africa, where shutting coal, you have all these old coal power plants which are very inefficient, polluting a lot. The government itself, I think, is aiming at closing 10 gigawatt of coal power plants in the next decade. And renewable energy will help a lot, but having some gas, and in South Africa, local gas is limited, so LNG could make sense. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's also something that we are looking at in Sierra Leone, where, again, natural environment, you have some hydro, but it's limited. You do not have local gas, and LNG may be a solution, again, as a transition fuel.
Thank you very much, everyone. The next question actually came to me, Bertrand, during your presentation when you were talking about, and Wale, you touched upon this as well, the sources of emissions from the African continent and how the breakdown is quite different from when we look at North America or Europe in the contributions of the power sector to emission intensity. So looking at how high the emission intensity of agriculture, forestry, and other industries are, I wonder if we could look at that through the context of electrification. And could you talk a little bit about the role that developing energy infrastructure, expanding energy access could play, perhaps in cutting down deforestation for firewood and other uses? And can we use energy as a tool, energy development as a tool to offset emissions intensity in other sectors?
Okay, but do you want to go ahead, or or should I?
Look, I'm not sure I have much on this one for sure. When we talk about energy access and this 50% of people who do not have power, or who have power but of poor quality and a very high price, obviously it comes at a lot of economic and climate cost not to have the power, including, and that's what you are alluding to, people using biomass or cutting wood or charcoal, which is not the best way in any country. So from that standpoint, it's kind of all of the above. Strengthening the grid, bringing traditional source of power, or going off grid where it makes sense, obviously is the first solution to that. Beyond this, let me hand over to you, Wale, for additional light.
Yeah, my view, I mean, the whole thing about energy transition is about electrification. We're being told that we have to electrify every single aspect of our lives. And so as we bring more electrification on board, it's going to affect things like cooking, and one of the biggest sources of deforestation is, forests being cut down to make charcoal, etc. And so if we can find a way, I mean, of electrifying, then we move more towards cleaner sources. And again, gas has a role here because you have compressed natural LPG, which is cooking gas, which is going to help with that story. And again, as we urbanize and look at ways in which we do our land use planning, again, hopefully that should, and even things like grazing cattle, and there are still many cultures that have these migratory patterns, and that doesn't help your land use planning. So urbanization is going to help. Hopefully that leads to more efficient electrification, and so that will hopefully change the patterns around the emissions we're seeing in Africa right now. I'm not sure when plant-based agriculture is going to get to Africa. We have to feed people first before we start looking at more those technologies. But again, that also helps with agricultural emissions, especially from livestock. Thank you.
Wonderful. Lily, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add on this.
Yeah, I think the only comment I would make is that I think as we think electrification, I think we also have to begin to think about how we handle the hard to abate sectors and some of the sectors which we can't electrify. And especially as countries in Africa urbanize, and as we anticipate growing demand for transportation fuel, for fuels for industry, I do think that is also another area which demands significant attention, and that we need to begin thinking about what zero carbon options there could look like. I think most of the options there are pretty expensive options right now, but we do need to begin at least pursuing a research agenda that helps us to begin to explore what the potential for those on the continent will be.
Thank you very much, and actually that transitions me into the next question I wanted to ask. Lily, you talked about this in your remarks, but I think obviously everyone understands the important role that financial institutions and donor finance can play in accelerating energy development, but we also can't forget about the human capacity development side of building out Africa's energy that will enable building out Africa's energy infrastructure. So what can, and I'll shine a light here on our organizers, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, and as an example of a US lab that leads research efforts, what can NETL and other US labs, European labs, do to further engage with African research institutions, with technology development labs at utilities and African companies, and who should they be looking to work with to build out that human capacity that will drive Africa's energy future?
Thank you, and great question. I think it's this is one of the things I'm really focusing on in my work as well. I think that this is a really important area for action so far as Africa's energy transition and development is concerned. I think that in many ways the continent has somewhat been positioned as a consumer of technologies for a long time. And I think that given where we are, given what the potential that Africa has in terms of our growth, economic growth, given the fact that by 2050, 1 in every 4 persons we meet on this planet could be African. I think that we need to see or play a more leadership role in thinking about and shaping our energy future. And I do think that there are researchers, there are institutions of higher learning on the ground who are interested in pursuing this, but most of the time, due to capacity constraints, due to funding constraints, are not able to do this. And so I see great opportunity for collaboration between the US DOE, this lab, and institutions of higher learning where there's huge interest in exploring some of these options. I'm working with folks in Kenya who are really looking into advanced geothermal and the potential for the regional application of advanced geothermal. There's growing interest in hydrogen, fuel cells, and the research that undergirds that. And I think these are huge opportunities for us to be able to build a bridge across both African and US experts who are working in this area. Several nonprofits I know are engaged in this space. Clean Air Task Force is trying to do this, serving as a bridge between US experts and African researchers to think of an agenda that is well suited to the African context, so that as we think of the next frontier and as we think of the energy transition, we are not developing solutions that are ill-suited for the context, solutions that do not take the local both the local human resource, but also natural resource endowment into consideration, as we should. But it helps us to build together a more forward-looking and effective agenda. And I think there's great appetite on the continent for this. And I think what we need to do is to be able to build the connections between the institutions here in the US and those on the continent in Africa.
Thank you, Lily, and I'll make a selfish plug about your remark about geothermal, because for the last 8 years, a big part of my job has been managing the U.S. East Africa Geothermal Partnership funded by USAID. So we work extensively with KenGen, and I think what we're seeing there, which I think would be a model for other sectors, is Kenya becoming not a recipient of capacity building as much as becoming a consulting and training arm for the rest of the East African Rift area, and it's a real encouraging model that hopefully can be replicated in other sectors. But my own work aside, I'd go back to Bertrand and Wale. I don't know if you have anything to add about perhaps the role of international financial institutions in human capacity building as well, and how that might accelerate the path to a net zero energy future.
Wale, you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we have a big role to play in that, and that's something that we're always looking at all the time, because there's a real need to involve local communities when you do these renewable energy projects. So, for instance, we have our Desert to Power initiative where we're trying to roll out the world's largest solar zone across the Sahel. And one of the things that you get when you go there, countries like Mali, Burkina, etc., is how are we going to recycle these solar panels when things go wrong? Who's going to fix them? And again, a lot of people don't think about that. What happens when you get a very windy day and these solar panels get blown away, or it's happened with hurricanes, and who's going to repair them? Do you have to fly in experts every time something goes wrong? So you really have to provide local capacity and create jobs. There are several schemes that we have for women, gender, how you train women to become installers, and how you get more women into the energy sector, which is a sector that has lacked more equal participation of women for a long time. And so that aspect is absolutely critical, and it's important for the sector's long-term sustainability. And then there's a lot of talk right now about the diversification of supply chains. We've seen that within the supply chain for things like solar, the expertise is concentrated in certain regions of the world. And you know what's happened with COVID, and there's more talk around localizing your supply chains to avoid supply disruptions. And so African countries also have to think about that. I mean, we've seen that in the context of vaccines, where we realize that there's nowhere in Africa, no one's making vaccines in Africa, and you have to stay at the end of a long queue before we can get our populations vaccinated. Now, that needs to change, and the same has to happen as we move towards this transition. Many of these technologies that are needed because the raw materials are in Africa, we'll have to find a way of making sure we can localize some of these productions and diversify supply chains for the benefit of the continent. And the research that you guys are doing is going to be absolutely critical in looking at many of these issues, looking at technologies that can be transferred to local populations. And the best places to site these, you know, whether they're manufacturing plants or to create clusters of expertise. One of the initiatives we also have is the specialized economic zones, where we're working with countries to see, in some places, maybe you're creating an energy city, you know, that is going to attract investment along the energy value chain. So, you know, there are quite a number of ideas, and there's a lot for us to do together as donors of development financial institutions.
Maybe look, what Lily and Wale mentioned really does resonate with me. In particular, what Wale was, you know, partly focusing on, or what local capacity building in the solar supply chain could really bring. Again, really does resonate. I would add also in the off-grid space, that's really one where it's you really need to have solutions which are tailor-made for a given country, a given context, a given region, from a technical but also from a social standpoint. Each situation is different, and here factoring as much as possible of this local knowledge and local capacity is really key to have successful business models, rather than to try to placate something which is standard and in many cases will not work. And the other topic, which I'm calling again and again, because in my many years of experience, and I, you know, started my career, Lily's from Ghana. I started my career now kind of 30 years ago in Ghana, working on the power sector, and at the time trying to help improve the situation of ECG, which was already plagued by very high losses and so on. And we know that at times it has improved and at times it has gone down. And when you look at, you know, ECG or many other utilities in the continent, you know, strengthening this governance management capabilities, strengthening the ability to reduce losses is really key. So it may not appear directly in the topic we are talking today, but my strong belief is that if you do not make progress on that, you are kind of running on a treadmill or building on sand.
Very well put. Thank you all. I'd like to now transition back to a little bit of a focus on gas, and particularly Bertrand and Wale, this question may apply more to you, but I think we've all seen the recently released IPCC climate report and the you know, the critical position we find ourselves in regarding methane emissions and climate change. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Treasury just issued new guidance for U.S. investments in multilateral banks, essentially saying they'll oppose all coal-based projects, that there's limited windows for the support of gas projects in the midstream and downstream sector, but only when they meet very specific criteria. Bertrand, I believe it was in your presentation you touched upon, it may have been Wale, excuse me, but touched upon the conditions for which the bank would support gas-based power projects going forward. But I'd just like to ask you, do you see these restrictions tightening over time? Will it help to accelerate the development of net zero gas and a net zero energy future, or what's your outlook for the future of international financial institutions investing in gas projects?
Bertrand, please go ahead.
Yeah, so look, so on that, in line with what we discussed today, we do see room for a need for selectively for gas in Africa. That has been the main topic of today. Obviously, as mentioned, when we have to look at each country on its own basis. We have to look, as discussed earlier, about the needs, about the natural endowment of the country. And first and foremost, what can be done with renewable energy, solar, number one, wind in a number of countries, and large hydro coming next that we have to continue to develop. And then there is room for gas, as we discussed today. And we feel that, so it's our position. We feel that overall it's consistent with the guidance provided by the US recently regarding MDBs, where obviously the debate becomes much more complex is when you move to countries in Africa with still very low access to more middle-income countries, and what's the role of gas in this transition, in particular, for instance, in Asia. But that's another debate. As concerns the topic of today in Africa, I feel that there is overall alignment and agreement that gas has still a role to play.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the guidance issued by the US is in line with the general direction which the MDBs are moving anyway. I mean, the fact of the matter is all African countries are signatory to the Paris Agreement. So they've already signed. They have nationally determined contributions that they have to fulfill. And part of our role is to help them develop their projects in line with the NDCs that they've signed up to, and also developing those NDCs and their long-term plans to comply with the obligations under the Paris Agreement. And there's also a recognition within the Paris Agreement that African countries are going to peak later than the more developed countries. That's the expectation, because many of the more developed economies are already peaking, and the likes of China expect to peak, by maybe 2030 or so, and achieve net zero by 2060. So the main thing is that we have to maintain Africa's voice, and we have to ensure that there's a just transition, because it's very easy to just come down on Africa with a sledgehammer and not recognizing that we have to be given the opportunity to grow. So within that context, it's a very difficult negotiation, but Africa needs to be saying that if you were to close 3 to 4 of the most polluting coal plants in places like China, and Europe, then you can still afford to build more gas plants in Africa, because the impact of doing that will be much more significant than the impact of, like Bertrand said in his presentation, if you increase by 50%, you're still at 0.9% impact. So I think that kind of debate needs to happen within the straitjackets that Africa has been given for its development.
Perhaps to dialogue. I mean, the case in point for me is if we use the example of Mozambique, where if you kind of fly in and say to Mozambique, look, from now on you have to decarbonize your power sector and your emissions have to go down. I don't think it makes sense, because first, emissions as of today are close to zero, and you have 1/3 of the population only which has access. So what's being done, I think, which has a lot of sense, you have a government with support of various agencies and donors who has a pretty good overall approach in terms of thinking ahead what type of energy mix they want to have in terms of hydro, in terms of solar, in terms of gas, trying to have something which is as sustainable and cost effective as possible, absolutely. But at the same time, acknowledging, it goes back to the point of Walid, that in the coming years, the emissions in Mozambique will go up before plateauing and going down, but it's very fine because they will go up from virtually zero to virtually zero, and that will allow to bring energy to two-thirds of the population.
Yeah, I thought that the chart or the graphic that you had in your presentation showing the 50% increase is quite an eye-opening one, and one that needs to be shared further as well, and a light shown on that. So, Lily, I'll offer you the opportunity to chime in if you like, or we do have another question from the audience that I can pose to everyone. Okay. This is an audience question, picking up on the remarks that we were just talking about with local human capacity development, solar panel waste, recycling, innovation, and localizing the supply chain. So I'd like to ask for all panelists, how do you see the role of or the opportunity for developing a circular economy in energy systems in Africa going forward? Are there any particular sectors where you see this could be useful, perhaps solar, but I'll open it up to everyone if you have any thoughts on how we push towards a circular economy in the energy sector in Africa.
Ladies first.
Thanks, Wally. I think this is that's a great question. I think it's a hard one as well, in terms of thinking circular economy and where this could play a role in Africa's energy systems. But I do think that whenever I think about the idea of a circular economy, I always go back to how a lot of rural Africa has lived for many years. And the fact that in many ways, though we didn't call it a circular economy, that's really what it was, that you really had a very interconnected system where everything was linked to everything, and where there was a lot of impetus on the local level to preserve the systems that we have. I think what has been missing as we grow and as we develop is really a breakdown in our understanding of the interconnections between all these many different sectors. And that comes from, basically how we've structured our ministries, basically how we've structured our sectors of development. So we basically end up with siloing our thinking when we actually did build up and have all evolved in many ways from systems which were essentially by nature circular. So I do think that I do not have an answer for which sector we could lead with first, but I do think that going back to pick up on some of our traditional knowledge systems where inherent in that was the notion of circular economies and how they function will be relevant. I was in another discussion yesterday, and I was saying that we need to really begin to rethink the types of knowledge systems that are brought into this discussion and which are justified as valid. I think we have left behind a lot which has a role to play. So I do think that in conclusion that the notion of a circular economy is not a new thing at all on the continent. I think that if you go back to a lot of our rural systems, it was inherent in how we were organized and how we lived and how we interacted with nature and how we extracted and dealt with nature. And so going back to some of those values will be critical. I leave it there. Wally, back to you. And thanks for passing that to me.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and it's an area that we're also getting to grips with. In fact, about a year and a half ago, we established our first circular economy fund with support from the government of Finland. And it's just inevitable that we have to look at how we're recycling, because we have to move from this intense consumer society and look at how we can recycle more of the things that we use. So in terms of our own agenda, obviously we'll be looking to work with a lot of the innovative ideas out there to look for ways in which we can find solutions that benefit our economies and that make a difference. But it's still very much a learning process, certainly for all involved. I mean, 5 years ago, I'd never heard of the term circular economy. So, so we will learn as we go, but it's an important area, an important aspect, you know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have a question here specifically for Wale, and you've touched upon this a little bit, but I think as we're coming towards the end of our Q&A session here, perhaps as just a wrap-up point, we've spoken about Mozambique and the project. Obviously, the African Development Bank is heavily involved in that project on the financing side. Could you just give us a vision for the future, looking forward, understanding that the project has some difficulties now with unrest, but plans to still move forward. How important will that project be to getting gas out to other countries as well in Africa that may not have the domestic reserves? What role will it play in helping drive us towards a cleaner energy future overall? I suppose just your final thoughts on that project and its role in Africa's gas sector.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. The project is immensely important to the future of Mozambique. You're talking approximately $24 billion worth of investment. That's over 100% of the country's GDP. I mean, it's transformational. And what's happening right now is unfortunate. However, it's good to see the commitment of the investors as well as the governments and regional governments, in trying to build stability, to bring stability back to that region of Mozambique. And the development is also transformational for the Southern Africa region. If you talk to the South Africans, the quickest way in which they're going to decarbonize their grid and move away from coal is gas. And they have, a gas master plan, and the gas from Mozambique is a key part of that. It's also important for the development of Mozambique itself, because we're working with the government to see how they can use that gas domestically. And we mustn't forget, I mean, Mozambique has hydro resources, which is very good. But when we start talking about adaptation, because a lot of people focus on mitigation, but adaptation is also a big area for Africa. And the impact of climate change is that you're getting many reservoirs are drying up. And so you still need your gas to give you that resilience during period of droughts. I mean, there was a water emergency in Cape Town some years ago. You recall, I think they said they had 24 hours before they were going to run out of water because all the aquifers were drying up. So yes, hydro is renewable, but we have to build in resilience. We have to look at the adaptation aspect, and gas from places like Mozambique will provide that resilience for the region. And in terms of fragility, there are too many fragile states in Africa, and unfortunately, we seem to be regressing lately. We have to change that trend. So projects of this nature for us, and it's one of the reasons why we got involved, despite the strong opposition, but we just felt that there was more good that could come from this project in all aspects, and we'll try to mitigate the downsides.
Now, look, really taking it from there, again, I 100% agree with all the points that were made, including that it's really great projects on all the counts mentioned, all of them, including with this regional view and bringing gas to South Africa. I would add also broadening the spectrum that it's also a very good project to bring some gas to Asia, which again, one day, hopefully, we'll have 100% of the electricity being produced entirely clean. We'll get there. But in the meantime, we need to transition. And when you focus about coal, which, as we know, is the bulk of the problem, 72% of CO2 emission produced by the power sector, Asia is very particular in the sense that the average age of coal power plant in the US is above 30 years. It's the same in Europe, to some extent, even in South Africa. The average age of coal power plants is really high. Now in Asia, it's kind of around 12 years. And you have a number of countries which continue to build coal power plants. So that, from a climate standpoint, really has to stop. And also there will be a very hard work at some point to decommission some of these existing plants with, in Asia, as mentioned, plants which tend to be much younger than in other parts of the world. So this shipping, finding really fairly cheap gas resource that you can ship to Asia, when you look at it from a realistic standpoint, is absolutely key to win this climate war.
Thank you, Bertrand. And now I'd like to move to a final wrap-up question for you as well, because you've talked about the IFC's approach to investing in gas projects, but I think from a broader perspective as well, what I see around the world is that many other investment banks look to IFC and World Bank and the performance, environmental standards, and sustainability standards that are part and parcel of your projects and investments. So I'd ask you, I guess, in closing, do you see those, or what role do you see those environmental standards playing in driving not just Africa, but around the world, developing economies towards a net zero future, using gas, of course, as an important displacement of coal and other higher polluting generation sources?
I think as such, our ENS performance standards do not cover specifically this energy mix question. They were designed at the time where it was not yet a major area of focus, and in any case, I don't think it's what they are meant for. So broadly, they touch on the various environmental and social aspect that you could expect to. But on that topic that we've been discussing today, I think it's a separate discussion. On which I do feel there is, really a really good alignment between the various counterparts here. So it's more a matter of, development institution and their shareholders to, for me, to try to continue to push things, but in a way which is as much as possible fact-based, realistic, and taking into account the situation of each and every country. As we discussed earlier, and hopefully we will see, especially with COP26, some degree of convergence between these various stakeholders.
Thank you for building a bridge across a river that I built there with the question. That was very well put. Finally, for Lily, I'd like to turn to you and. We've spoken about this today. It was, part of your remarks as well. But given how much you've written and dedicated your thoughts to the intersection of energy development and climate resilience and climate change mitigation, I'd like to just ask you maybe for your final thoughts on how do we balance the energy transition with expansion of energy access in Africa. Just perhaps a summary of those three key points that you raised during your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And yeah, indeed, I think we've kind of done justice to this question today. And so I think in terms of my my final reflections, I think the core thing that I would want us to take away today, and I get the sense that it really resonates with everyone already, is that in Africa, development must be central to the clean energy transition. And the recognition that the continent needs immediate access to cost-effective energy sources, which are aligned to its scale of urbanization and growth, ambitions and targets is going to be critical to that. I think that is going to be an important entry point to help us think about very pragmatic solutions as we think of how we evolve and build out the continent's energy systems within climate limits. And I think building off of that, really thinking about how we tailor the transition to Africa's unique resource needs, thinking about how we exploit the synergies between the energy and other development sectors. So not just on the supply side strategies, but thinking about how we complement that with these demand side efforts, and really also thinking and seeing this clean energy transition as an opportunity for Africa to take charge of really defining its energy future. And I see that as the biggest opportunity that lies ahead of us. And I think that this is really a call to African experts, institutions of higher learning, researchers all across the globe, and internationally, really thinking about how we collaborate to actively contribute to a research and innovation agenda that paves the way for commercializing and making some of the zero carbon technologies available on the continent. Of course, being cognizant of the fact that this is not going to happen overnight. And while we build out the foundations for that clean energy future, that we need to understand and recognize how we manage what is available to us today. So how do we deal with our natural gas resources today? How do we develop with that? And how do we do that being mindful of the fact that the climate is at risk, but also that the global economy is shifting and we do not want Africa to be left behind. So that I would end it there. And thank you so much for having me as part of this wonderful panel.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists. To briefly sum up, I think what we've talked about, just on top of what you've heard as final thoughts here, what I think is clear is that we need to approach energy development in the context of facing climate change, looking at local context and understanding that the energy transition is different everywhere we work, everywhere where we need to develop new energy infrastructure. There can be a different meaning and different definition of a clean energy transition, and that we do need to take into account the human development and economic development side as equally important. And gas in its current form already for Africa presents a valid clean energy transition option, but that we also see a need for continued research and development of new technologies, and that critical to that will be partnering with organizations like the National Energy Technology Laboratory, building on the research and development done by the Department of Energy and its counterparts, and working in close concert with international financial institutions, with local governments, utilities, to also ensure that we have that on the ground human capacity and enabling environment to move these projects forward. So there was one other question from the audience that I would like to turn over perhaps to the organizers, Anthony or someone from NETL, if perhaps you could answer this. Presentations from the speakers during this workshop, will they be available to participants after the fact?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. This is Anthony. I'll jump in here. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for leading this panel. It was truly outstanding. You did a fantastic job of keeping the discussion going and asking pointed questions and just leading this session. Really remarkable. Bertrand, Wale, Lily, thank you all so much. You all did a tremendous job, and the discussion today was really good and impactful. And I think this is really what we set out to do, was to have this kind of discussion in this forum, and we definitely succeeded in that today. Tomorrow we have three topics: CCUS, emissions, and added value markets. I think tomorrow's sessions will be just as good, if not even better, I hope. But to get back to your question, Andrew, the plan is to edit the recording and have that as a resource in addition to the slides. If everybody could send those to myself and Bubba, who helped we reached out to you all about organizing this. If you've already sent your slides, you're good. If you haven't, please send those to us. We'll package everything up into a PDF and share those with whoever is interested. And we plan to start tomorrow around the same time. So if you don't have any further questions, that would end today's session. And I thank everybody so much.
Nope, just one final thank you to our panelists. All credit for any stimulating conversation goes to the three of them. So Lily, Wale, Bertrand, thank you very much. And I look forward to speaking further in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.